I never expected clarity to arrive this quietly. People always describe life-changing moments as if they announce themselves first. They imagine a dramatic conversation, a confession that rearranges everything, a single event that divides life into before and after. It sounds convincing when someone tells the story years later, but I don't think that's how transformation actually happens. The deepest changes don't interrupt your life. They blend into it. They arrive so naturally that you don't recognize them while they're happening. Only later, when you look back, do you realize something fundamental has shifted beneath every ordinary moment you thought meant nothing. That's where I find myself now, not standing at the beginning of something, not standing at the end either, somewhere in between, where certainty no longer belongs to the person I used to be, but uncertainty hasn't fully become the person I'm becoming. It's an uncomfortable place, not because it feels unstable, because it feels undeniable. I've spent years believing that understanding another person required time. I believed familiarity was earned through repetition, through shared experiences, through conversations that slowly peeled away the layers people spend their lives protecting. That belief made sense. It was predictable, save every meaningful connection I had ever witnessed followed the same rhythm. First came curiosity, then trust, then understanding. Step by step, nothing rushed, nothing skipped, until something happened that refused to follow any of those rules. You entered my awareness without asking for space inside it. Not dramatically, not loudly. You simply existed in a way my mind couldn't categorize. At first, I ignored it. Not because I wasn't paying attention, but because paying attention would have required me to admit that something unusual was happening. And I wasn't ready for that. It's easier to dismiss what doesn't fit your expectations. Easier to call it coincidence than question the structure you've trusted for years. So, I convinced myself there was nothing different. I told myself I was imagining the strange familiarity that everyone occasionally meets someone who seems easier to understand than expected, that there was nothing beneath it, nothing worth examining, but reality has a habit of repeating itself until denial becomes impossible. The moments kept returning, small moments, almost invisible, the kind nobody else would remember. A pause that somehow said more than an entire conversation, a glance that felt less like observation and more like recognition, silences that never became uncomfortable. Most people think silence is empty. I don't. Silence reveals more than language ever can. Words can be edited. Silence cannot. When people stop speaking, they usually rush to fill the emptiness because they're afraid of what it exposes. They laugh too quickly. They change the subject. They reach for explanations nobody asked for, anything to avoid sitting inside the truth that silence naturally uncovers. You never did that. You allowed quiet to exist exactly as it was. No pressure, no urgency, no attempt to rescue the moment from itself. And somehow that made every unspoken thought feel visible, not exposed. There's a difference. Exposure feels invasive, dividsy feels understood. I've spent most of my life making sure people could never mistake one for the other. It's not that I enjoy hiding, it's that I've learned how easily people misunderstand depth. Most don't actually see what's in front of them. They see what makes sense to them. Then they call it understanding. Someone notices one part of you and assumes they've discovered the whole picture. Someone hears one opinion and decides they know your character. Someone watches your reactions for a few weeks and begin speaking as if they've solved you like a puzzle. I've never liked that, not because they're wrong, because they're incomplete. Incomplete understanding has always felt more dangerous than ignorance. Someone who admits they don't know you leaves room for discovery. Someone who believes they already understand you stops looking. That's when projection begins. That's when people slowly replace who you are with who they expect you to become. I've watched it happen more times than I can count. So I learned something. If people insist on creating versions of you inside their minds, give them as little material as possible. Remain difficult to define. Not mysterious, just careful. Careful about what deserves explanation. Careful about who receives access. Careful about which parts of yourself survive careless interpretation. That strategy worked for a long time. Long enough that I stopped questioning it, until I noticed it wasn't working with you. Not because you demanded more. You never demanded anything. You weren't searching for hidden meanings. You weren't trying to unlock me. You simply noticed things that most people overlook entirely: the pauses between sentences, the thoughts behind the words, instead of the words themselves. The difference between what I meant and what I decided to say. You listened beyond language. That unsettled me. Not because I disliked it, because I couldn't explain it. Understanding usually arrives after explanation. With you, explanation seemed unnecessary, as if something had already connected before either of us became aware of it. I've tried to understand why that feels so significant. Maybe it's because recognition changes the way distance functions. Distance only works when someone remains outside your perspective. Once someone begins seeing the architecture beneath your behavior, physical space becomes almost irrelevant. They're already somewhere closer, not emotionally, mentally. I've realized people often confuse emotional closeness with genuine understanding. They're not the same thing. You can spend years emotionally attached to someone who never truly understands how your mind works. And you can encounter someone briefly who recognizes patterns you've never spoken aloud. Time doesn't always determine depth. Sometimes precision does. Sometimes accuracy accomplishes what years never could. That thought stayed with me longer than I expected. It kept resurfacing in ordinary moments. I'd notice myself reaching a conclusion, then wondering how you would interpret the same situation. Not because I needed validation, because your perspective had become unexpectedly valuable. That was new. I don't usually invite other minds into my own thinking process. I've always trusted my ability to examine ideas independently, question them, dissect them, rebuild them. I never felt the need for another perspective because I rarely found one that revealed something I hadn't already considered. Then you appeared, not replacing my thoughts, expanding them. There's an important distinction. Influence changes what you think. Perspective changes how you think. One can disappear, the other becomes part of your structure. That's what concerns me. Because structural change isn't temporary. Once your foundation shifts, everything built upon it shifts too. The strange part is, I don't remember giving permission for that to happen. I don't remember deciding that your presence should matter this much. There wasn't a moment where I consciously lowered my guard, no dramatic realization, no emotional surrender. Just a gradual awareness that somewhere along the way, the usual distance between myself and everyone else had quietly dissolved. Not completely. Just enough that I noticed it. Enough that pretending otherwise became dishonest. Honesty has always mattered to me more than comfort. If something is true, I'd rather face it than invent a simpler explanation, even when the truth complicates everything, especially then. That's why I keep returning to this, not because I'm searching for certainty, but because certainty has already arrived. The uncertainty comes afterward. The certainty is simple. Something changed. The uncertainty is deciding what that change actually means. I've considered every ordinary explanation. Maybe familiarity creates the illusion of depth. Maybe timing makes people appear more significant than they are. Maybe coincidence, repeated, often enough, begins looking intentional. I explored every possibility. None of them lasted. Each explanation eventually collapsed beneath the same observation. You never felt unfamiliar. That shouldn't make sense. Nothing in logic explains why someone you've barely known can feel strangely recognizable, yet recognition doesn't ask permission from logic, it simply appears. I've stopped trying to force it into categories that were never designed to contain experiences like this. Not everything meaningful arrives with a definition attached. Some things exist long before language catches up to them. Perhaps that's why I've remained quiet for so long, not because I lacked words, because every word felt smaller than what it was trying to describe. Language organizes reality, but sometimes reality expands faster than language can follow. This feels like one of those moments. Every sentence I form circles the same truth without fully touching it. You're not important because you've changed my emotions. Emotions rise. They fade. They transform. Their movement. This is different. You've changed the way I organize perception itself, the way I notice details, the way I evaluate conversations, the way silence carries meaning, the way I distinguish between people who merely hear and people who genuinely understand. Once perception changes, nothing else remains exactly the same. You can't return to an earlier way of seeing after discovering a clearer one. You can pretend. You can ignore it for a while. But clarity doesn't disappear because it's inconvenient. It waits fortnightly until you're willing to admit that the person you were before this realization no longer exists in quite the same way. I think that's where I am now, standing between two versions of myself. One that believed distance was enough to preserve everything important. Another beginning to understand that sometimes preservation isn't the highest form of protection. Sometimes truth is. And maybe that's what this has been asking from me all along. Not certainty, not explanation. Just the willingness to stop pretending that some encounters are ordinary when every quiet part of me already knows they aren't. The strange thing about recognition is that it never argues for its own existence. It doesn't convince you, it doesn't demand your attention, it simply remains, quietly but tetly, almost as if it knows that eventually you'll stop trying to explain it away and start admitting that it was real from the beginning. That's what happened to me, not all at once, not through some single unforgettable moment. It happened in fragments, in ordinary conversations that somehow stayed with me long after they ended, in pauses that felt complete without needing to become sentences, in the realization that I remembered the smallest details about you, not because I forced myself to, but because my mind had already decided they mattered before I understood why. I've always believed attention is one of the purest forms of truth. People claim to care about many things, but attention never lies. Your attention naturally moves toward what has become significant even before your conscious mind admits it. That's why I couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. Without meaning to, I had started noticing everything, the rhythm of your thoughts, the way your perspective never chased certainty, but somehow arrived there anyway, the way you questioned ideas without trying to destroy them, the way you listened as though understanding mattered more than responding. Those qualities are rare, not because people lack intelligence, because genuine observation requires patience. Most people don't observe, they compare, they predict, they categorize. They spend so much energy deciding what someone is that they forget to notice who they're becoming. You never seemed interested in conclusions. You stayed with the process. You allowed people to remain unfinished. I respected that more than I realized. Maybe because I've always felt unfinished myself, not incomplete. There's a difference. Incomplete suggests something is missing. Unfinished suggests something is still growing. I've never believed people reach a final version of themselves. We adapt. We refine. We outgrow ideas that once defined us. We discover strengths we didn't know existed, and weaknesses we thought we'd already conquered. Growth doesn't stop simply because we become comfortable. If anything, comfort often interrupts it. That's why your presence felt unusual. You didn't encourage comfort. You encouraged awareness without trying, without teaching, without telling me who I should become. You simply existed in a way that made self-deception more difficult. I started noticing habits I had mistaken for personality, batards I had accepted as permanent, walls I called principles. Dist I described as independence, control I defended as discipline. The more honestly I examined them, the harder it became to separate protection from limitation. Some things I thought were preserving me had actually been preventing me. That realization stayed with me for days, not because it was painful, because it was precise. Precision has always affected me more deeply than emotion. Emotion can overwhelm you. Precision quietly rearranges your thinking until one day you realize you've been living differently without ever announcing the decision. That's how real change happens. It doesn't ask for applause, it integrates. I've begun wondering how many versions of myself were built around expectations that no longer belong to me. How many assumptions I've carried simply because they once kept me safe. How many conclusions survived long after the experiences that created them disappeared. It's strange how the mind works. It remembers danger long after the danger itself has passed. It keeps reinforcing old structures because familiarity feels more reliable than possibility. I understand why. Predictability creates stability, but stability isn't always the same as truth. Sometimes we're loyal to an outdated version of ourselves simply because we've known it longer. Maybe that's why meeting certain people feels so disruptive, not because they change us directly, because they reveal that change had already begun before we noticed it. I've stopped thinking of influence as something one person does to another. Real influence doesn't impose, it uncovers. It reveals thoughts that were waiting beneath the surface all along. You never handed me new beliefs. You simply made it impossible to ignore the questions I'd been quietly avoiding. Questions about why I hold myself at such a careful distance. Questions about why certainty has always mattered more to me than possibility. Questions about whether protecting yourself eventually becomes another way of imprisoning yourself. Those questions don't leave once they arrive. They stay, not demanding answers, just refusing to disappear. I used to think strength meant remaining unchanged regardless of circumstances. Now I'm beginning to suspect the opposite might be true. Maybe real strength is allowing reality to reshape you without losing yourself in the process. There's courage in consistency, but there's also courage in revision, in admitting that something you've believed for years no longer reflects who you've become. Revision has always frightened people. It feels like betrayal, as though changing your mind somehow erases every version of yourself that came before. I don't see it that way anymore. Growth doesn't erase, it includes. Every previous version still exists. They're simply no longer making the decisions. That thought has brought me an unexpected sense of peace. For years, I believed I had to defend every part of who I was. Now, I wonder whether some parts were quietly asking to be released, not because they were wrong, because they had already served their purpose. It's difficult to let go of identities that once protected you, even when they no longer fit, especially then. There's comfort in familiarity, even when familiarity becomes restrictive. Maybe that's why I resisted acknowledging what this connection was doing to me. Not because I feared you. I feared becoming someone unfamiliar to myself. Identity changes slowly, so slowly that we rarely notice it happening, until suddenly we respond differently to situations that once felt predictable. I've noticed that happening lately. Conversations that once exhausted me now simply pass by. Things that once demanded explanations no longer seem important. Silence has become less about absence and more about presence. I've stopped measuring people by how much they say. Instead, I notice how they make space, how they allow complexity to exist without immediately trying to simplify it. How comfortable they are admitting they don't know something. Humility has become more impressive to me than confidence. Confidence often speaks first. Understanding usually waits. You taught me that without ever intending to. Or perhaps I finally became ready to notice something that had always been true. Readiness changes perception. The same truth can exist in front of two people, yet only one recognizes it, because recognition depends as much on timing as it does on observation. Maybe that's why life introduces certain people exactly when it does. Not because fate is arranging everything, because we're finally capable of seeing what was previously invisible. I've wondered whether we underestimate timing. We celebrate opportunity, we admire talent, we praise effort, yet timing quietly determines how all of those things are received. A lesson heard too early sounds like noise. The same lesson heard at the right moment becomes wisdom. Perhaps people are similar. Perhaps understanding isn't only about who someone is. Perhaps it's also about who we've become when we meet them. That possibility changes everything. It removes the need to force meaning. It allows significance to unfold naturally. I've never liked forcing anything. Not conversations, not relationships, not understanding. Anything genuine should be able to survive patience. If it requires constant pressure to remain alive, perhaps it was never alive to begin with. This never required pressure. That's another reason I couldn't dismiss it. Nothing about this felt manufactured. There were no performances, no attempts to appear impressive, no need to create intensity where none existed. Everything meaningful happened quietly, almost invisibly, like roots growing beneath the surface long before anyone sees the tree. People admire visible growth. Few appreciate invisible foundations. Yet foundations determine everything. Without them, height becomes dangerous. I've spent much of my life strengthening foundations nobody else could see: discipline, reflection, self-awareness, patience. They rarely receive recognition, because they're difficult to display, but they're what everything else depends on. Meeting someone who naturally values those same invisible things feels uncommon, not impossible. Just uncommon enough that it changes how you define rarity. I've realized rarity isn't about finding someone who resembles you. It's finding someone whose way of seeing the world expands your own without asking you to abandon it. That's different. Agreement isn't what creates depth, perspective does. You don't need identical thoughts to recognize someone. Sometimes recognition comes from the shared willingness to keep questioning instead of pretending you've already arrived. I think that's what I respect most. Not certainty, curiosity disciplined by honesty, the ability to remain open without becoming directionless, to remain thoughtful without becoming cynical, to remain independent without becoming isolated. Balance, balance like that is difficult. It doesn't happen accidentally. It grows through years of choosing awareness over reaction. I've become more aware of my own reactions because of this. The moments where I instinctively retreat, the moments where I replace vulnerability with analysis, the moments where I convince myself understanding is safer than feeling. I've noticed them all, not to judge them, simply to see them clearly. Awareness doesn't always ask you to change immediately. Sometimes it only asks you to stop pretending you haven't noticed. That's enough for now, because every meaningful transformation begins the same way, not with action, with honesty. And if I'm being completely honest with myself now, there's one truth I can no longer avoid. This connection stopped being something I was studying a long time ago. Somewhere along the way, it became part of the lens through which I study everything else. Once that happens, distance loses its old meaning, not because closeness replaces it, but because genuine understanding quietly reshapes the space between two people until separation is no longer measured by how far apart they stand, but by how deeply they continue to recognize one another, even in silence. There comes a moment when reflection is no longer enough. You can examine every thought, trace every pattern, question every instinct, and still arrive at the same place. Not because you've run out of questions, but because the answers have quietly been standing in front of you the entire time. I think that's where I am now. Not searching anymore, not resisting either. Simply standing inside a truth that became impossible to rearrange into something smaller. For a long time, I believed the mind was capable of containing everything, every emotion, every contradiction, every realization. I believed if I understood something deeply enough, I could keep it safely inside myself without allowing it to alter the way I lived. Understanding felt like control. If I could explain it, I could manage it. If I could analyze it, I could prevent it from changing me. That belief stayed with me for years. It became part of the way I approached everything. Observe first, understand completely. Act only when certainty leaves no room for doubt. It seemed logical, responsible, even wise. But there's one flaw in that philosophy. Some truths don't exist to be managed. They exist to be lived. And the longer you keep them confined to thought alone, the heavier they become. I've begun to understand that awareness carries responsibility, not responsibility toward another person, responsibility toward yourself. Once you know something with complete honesty, pretending not to know it becomes exhausting. You can delay it. You can distract yourself. You can build elaborate explanations designed to keep everything exactly where it has always been. But eventually, reality asks the same quiet question again. What are you going to do with what you've already seen? I've asked myself that question more times than I can count. Not because I lack an answer, because I wanted a different one. I wanted this to remain something I could admire from a distance, something meaningful without becoming personal, something rare without becoming permanent. But life rarely asks what version of truth feels most convenient. It simply presents what is. The rest belongs to us. I've realized that people often fear change for the wrong reason. They think they're afraid of becoming someone different. I don't believe that's true anymore. I think we're afraid of discovering that the person we're becoming has been quietly waiting beneath the surface all along. That possibility changes everything. It means transformation isn't always creation. Sometimes it's recognition, the gradual uncovering of something that never stopped existing. Looking back, I can see how many moments were preparing me for this, conversations that taught me patience, silences that taught me listening, disappointments that taught me discernment. Every experience seemed unrelated while I was living through it. Now they appear connected. Not because life suddenly makes perfect sense, because perspective has a way of revealing patterns that time hides. Perhaps that's why wisdom always sounds simple after you've earned it. The complexity wasn't in the lesson. It was in becoming the person capable of understanding it. I've stopped asking why this happened. The question no longer serves me. A better question has taken its place. What kind of person do I become because of it? That question carries possibility instead of resistance. It shifts the focus away from explanation and toward intention. I've always believed intention shapes more than circumstance ever could. Circumstances introduce opportunities. Intention decides what survives them. So I ask myself honestly, what survives this? Not uncertainty that disappeared long ago, not curiosity that transformed into understanding, not hesitation. Even hesitation eventually grows tired of repeating the same argument. What survives is something quieter. Respect. Respect for a connection that never needed to prove itself. Respect for a presence that never demanded recognition, yet quietly earned it. Respect for the version of myself that finally stopped running from clarity simply because clarity required change. I've learned something unexpected through all of this. Depth doesn't ask you to become less independent. Real depth teaches you that independence and openness were never opposites to begin with. One protects your identity. The other allows it to evolve. Without openness, independence becomes isolation. Without independence, openness becomes dependence. The balance between them is where genuine strength begins. For years, I believed I understood that balance. Now I know I was only describing it. Living it is entirely different. Living it means allowing another person's existence to matter without surrendering your own. It means recognizing significance without turning it into possession. It means appreciating alignment without demanding certainty about the future. The future has never promised anyone certainty, only direction. And direction is enough. I've become less interested in knowing exactly where every path leads. Instead, I care whether I'm walking honestly, whether my actions reflect what I already know to be true. Integrity has become simpler to me than it once was. It's no longer about perfection. It's about consistency between what I recognize internally and what I allow myself to live externally. Anything less begins to feel like division. I've lived divided before. Thinking one thing, feeling another, expressing something entirely different because it seemed easier. It never lasted. Eventually, every divided life asks to become whole again. Maybe that's what this has been guiding me toward all along. Not another person, not another chapter. Wholeness, the quiet alignment between awareness, intention, and action. Everything else grows from there. I've noticed that peace doesn't arrive when every question has an answer. Peace arrives when the most important questions stop needing one. There was a time when I desperately wanted to define every detail of this, to know exactly what it meant, where it would lead, how it would unfold. Now, those questions feel strangely distant, not because they stopped mattering, because they stopped being the foundation. The foundation is simpler now. Truth recognized, honestly, has value regardless of what happens next. Outcomes matter, but they don't determine whether an experience was real. Reality exists before results ever appear. That understanding has changed something fundamental inside me. I no longer measure significance by permanence. Some things transform you precisely because they teach you how deeply one authentic connection can reshape an entire way of seeing. Whether it lasts forever or only long enough to awaken something essential doesn't reduce its importance. Meaning isn't measured by duration, it's measured by depth, and depth leaves traces that time cannot erase. I know that now, not because someone told me, because I've lived enough to recognize the difference. There are memories that fade. Then there are moments that quietly become part of your character. You stop remembering them because eventually you begin living from them. That's where this belongs, not stored somewhere in the past, integrated into the person moving forward. I've stopped seeing this as the story of meeting someone remarkable. It's become the story of discovering a different relationship with truth itself, a truth that asks nothing dramatic from me, only honesty, only presence, only the willingness to admit that sometimes life changes without making a sound. People often wait for certainty to feel complete before making a decision. I've learned certainty is rarely what moves us. Recognition does. The moment you recognize something deeply enough, the decision has already begun forming beneath the surface. Everything afterward is simply catching up to what your quieter self understood long before your conscious mind accepted it. Maybe that's why this no longer feels unfinished. Not because every answer exists, because the direction has become unmistakably clear. I don't know what every tomorrow will bring. No one does. But I know this. Some people pass through your life like passing seasons. They leave memories. Others leave perspective. Perspective is different. It becomes part of your vision. You stop noticing its presence because eventually it becomes the way you naturally see. And perhaps that's the quiet miracle hidden inside encounters like this. They don't ask you to become someone else. They remind you of the person you are always capable of becoming once you stopped mistaking protection for purpose and distance for strength. So I won't search for another explanation. I won't reduce this into words that feel smaller than what it has become. I'll simply acknowledge it for what it is. A turning point that never announced itself, a truth that arrived without demanding belief, a presence that quietly reshaped my understanding until I could no longer separate who I was from who I had become, and maybe that's the most honest conclusion I can reach. Some connections don't enter your life to be explained. They enter to awaken a part of you that had been waiting patiently and silently for the right moment to finally recognize itself. Once that awakening begins, there is no returning to the person you were before, not because you've lost them, but because you've finally grown into someone they were always hoping you would become.